June 28, 1942, El Alamein, Egypt. The sand tasted of iron and ash. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood at the edge of his command tent, squinting into the horizon where heat shimmers turned the desert into liquid glass. The sun hung low and merciless, a white disk bleeding through ochre dust clouds kicked up by retreating British armor. His boots, once polished to mirror shine in Berlin, were caked with the fine powder that infiltrated everything: engines, lungs, the creases of maps spread across folding tables. He held a tin cup of ersatz coffee, bitter and lukewarm, and watched his panzer divisions assemble in ragged columns stretching back toward Libya. They had chased the British across 400 miles of wasteland. They had tasted victory so close they could smell the Suez Canal in their dreams. And now, standing here at the edge of triumph, Rommel felt the first cold whisper of something he had not permitted himself to acknowledge until this moment: dread. The Afrika Korps had arrived in North Africa 15 months earlier as saviors, rescuing Mussolini's humiliated legions from total collapse. They had stormed across Cyrenaica with the precision of a surgical blade, turning British generals into footnotes and Churchill into a man haunted by midnight telegrams. Rommel himself had become a legend, Der Wüstenfuchs, the Desert Fox, a name spoken with equal parts admiration and fear in the tents of both armies. His soldiers believed in him with the fervor of crusaders. His enemies studied his tactics in staff colleges even as they fought him. And Hitler, distant in his Wolf's Lair bunker 3,000 miles away, had pinned his Mediterranean ambitions on this one man's genius for improvisation and speed. But genius, Rommel was learning, could not conjure fuel from sand or ammunition from sunlight. The numbers told a story his pride had refused to read until now. His divisions, 7 of them, 3 Panzer and 4 Italian infantry, had advanced so far and so fast that their supply lines stretched back across 1,000 miles of coastal road, perpetually harassed by British aircraft and desert commandos. Every liter of gasoline had to be shipped from Italy, unloaded at Tripoli or Benghazi, then trucked forward through a gauntlet of RAF bombers and the malevolent physics of sand that consumed half his vehicles before they ever reached the front. Every shell fired, every meal eaten, every bandage applied to a wounded man represented a logistical miracle performed by exhausted transport troops who drove through moonless nights to avoid the hunting Spitfires. The British, by contrast, were falling back onto their own bases. Every mile they retreated brought them closer to Alexandria, to Cairo, to the pyramids where Churchill had promised his generals there would be no further withdrawal. Every mile brought them closer to their supply depots, their repair facilities, their reinforcement pipelines stretching back through the Suez Canal to India and Australia and the inexhaustible armories of the United States. Rommel had read the intelligence reports. He knew what was coming. Hundreds of new Sherman tanks marked with American stars. Thousands of trucks rolling off Liberty ships faster than his Stukas could sink them. Artillery pieces, aircraft, fuel drums stamped with Texas Oil Company logos, an industrial flood that made Germany's trickle of supplies look like a man spitting into a bonfire. He had written to Berlin explaining this. He had sent his logistics officers back to Rome and Munich with maps and charts and the brutal arithmetic of modern war. He had requested, begged, for a pause, for time to consolidate, for permission to pull his exhausted divisions back to defensible positions around Benghazi where supply lines could be shortened and forces replenished. He had explained, with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis, that 7 divisions stretched across 400 miles of desert with dwindling fuel and ammunition could not hold against the storm building behind the British minefields at El Alamein. The response from Berlin had been a single word, transmitted through crackling radio static and repeated in Hitler's own handwriting on the telegram Rommel now carried folded in his breast pocket. Halten! Hold. It was an order, it was also a death sentence. Rommel had not always doubted. There had been a time, it seemed a lifetime ago, though it was merely 2 years, when the Führer's strategic vision had appeared flawless, when the very notion of questioning orders from Berlin would have struck him as treasonous cowardice. He had stood in the spring sunshine of 1940 watching his ghost division pour through the Ardennes, a steel river flowing through forests the French High Command had declared impassable for armor. He had raced across northern France at speeds that made his own superiors nervous, outrunning his supply lines and every conventional doctrine, proving that audacity and speed could shatter armies twice his size. The French had collapsed. The British had fled to Dunkirk. And Rommel had emerged from that campaign as the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, a prophet of mechanized blitzkrieg who made Napoleon look sluggish. Hitler had recognized his talent and rewarded it with Afrika. The assignment had seemed almost romantic at first, a desert crusade against the old British lion, a chance to write history across biblical sands. The early victories had come easily. Rommel's panzers swept aside British and Commonwealth forces with the same contemptuous ease they had shown in France. Tobruk fell. The British fell back. The Mediterranean became, briefly, a German lake. But Afrika was not France. Afrika had taught Rommel lessons that contradicted everything he had learned in the textbooks at the Kriegsakademie. In France, the roads had been paved, the railroads intact, the supply depots captured full of British and French fuel and food. In Afrika, the roads dissolved into sand tracks that consumed vehicles like quicksand. The railroads ended at Tripoli, 1,000 miles from where the fighting was happening. The captured British depots were empty, torched before evacuation, leaving nothing but scorched earth and booby traps. Everything had to be shipped across the Mediterranean through waters increasingly dominated by British submarines and Malta-based torpedo bombers that turned Italian convoys into funeral pyres illuminating the night sea. And still Hitler demanded advance. Attack, hold, never retreat. It was as if the Führer, staring at maps in his distant bunker, could not grasp the physical reality of distance and desert, could not comprehend that a panzer division without fuel was just a collection of steel monuments waiting for enemy artillery. Rommel had tried to explain this in his reports. He had used every diplomatic phrase available to a general addressing his supreme commander. He had couched his warnings in professional military language, avoiding anything that might be interpreted as defeatism or disloyalty. But the truth, the unvarnished truth that Rommel now understood with the clarity of a man staring into an abyss, was that Hitler did not care about logistics. The Führer believed, genuinely, fervently believed, that willpower could overcome material reality. He believed that German soldiers, properly motivated by ideology and led by men of iron character, could defeat any enemy regardless of numbers or supplies. He believed, with the faith of a mystic, that destiny favored the bold, and that retreat was a spiritual failure before it was a military necessity. It was madness, but it was madness with absolute authority, backed by the entire apparatus of the Nazi state, and enforced by men like Cadel and Jodl, who would rather sacrifice 100,000 soldiers than admit to their Führer that his strategic vision was detached from reality. The telegram ordering Rommel to hold at El Alamein had arrived on June 30th, 48 hours after he had sent his most urgent plea for permission to withdraw. He had been in his command vehicle when the radio man handed him the decoded message, and he had read it 3 times, searching for some qualifier, some conditional phrase that might give him room to interpret the order with flexibility. There was none. The language was absolute. He was to hold his positions. He was to prepare for renewed offensive operations as soon as supplies permitted. He was to understand that the strategic situation required German forces to maintain their positions regardless of tactical considerations. Rommel had dismissed the radio man and sat alone in the half-light of the command vehicle's interior, listening to the diesel generator hum and feeling the weight of 7 divisions pressing down on his shoulders. Outside, his soldiers were digging defensive positions in ground so hard it broke shovels, stringing wire across minefields that consumed their dwindling stocks of explosives, positioning their remaining 88 guns to cover approaches they all knew the British would eventually assault with overwhelming force. They trusted him. They believed he would find a way because he always had. The Desert Fox would improvise, would maneuver, would conjure some brilliant tactical surprise that would turn apparent disaster into victory. But there would be no surprise this time. Rommel could see the equation with mathematical certainty. The British were being reinforced faster than he could be resupplied. Their new commander, a methodical artilleryman named Montgomery, was not prone to the rash attacks that Rommel had exploited in previous battles. Montgomery was building a sledgehammer, accumulating tanks and guns and aircraft until he possessed such overwhelming superiority that German tactical skill would become irrelevant. When that sledgehammer fell, and it would fall probably in October when the weather cooled, Rommel's 7th divisions would be shattered. The survivors would flee westward across the same desert they had conquered with such confidence, harried every mile by aircraft and armor, leaving behind the burned-out hulks of irreplaceable panzers and the unmarked graves of men who had deserved better leadership. Unless Rommel retreated now, unless he pulled his forces back to the Libyan border, to positions where the supply distance was manageable and defensive lines could be properly fortified, unless he preserved his army to fight another day, accepting temporary loss of terrain for long-term strategic survival. But that would require disobeying a direct order from the Führer. It would require Rommel to place his military judgment above the will of the Supreme Commander, to commit what Nazi doctrine defined as the ultimate betrayal of loyalty. And Rommel, for all his tactical brilliance and growing doubts, was still a product of the Prussian military tradition. He was a general who had sworn oaths, who believed in the chain of command, who could not quite bring himself to cross the Rubicon of open disobedience. So he stayed. He ordered his exhausted troops to dig deeper, to ration fuel more carefully, to prepare for the battle they all knew was coming. And he watched the horizon each dawn, waiting for the dust clouds that would signal Montgomery's offensive, and wondered whether future historians would call him heroic or simply foolish. August 1942. The supply crisis became catastrophic. Rommel's fuel stocks dropped below 10 days' consumption. His ammunition reserves dwindled to the point where artillery batteries were rationed to 5 shells per gun per day, barely enough for harassing fire, useless for the kind of sustained bombardments that broke enemy attacks. His Italian divisions, already poorly equipped and demoralized by 2 years of defeats, began showing signs of disintegration. Desertions increased. Sickness from contaminated water and malnutrition swept through units whose field kitchens served meals that barely qualified as food. The Luftwaffe, which had once owned the skies over Egypt, now appeared in flights of 3 or 4 aircraft, hopelessly outnumbered by British squadrons that flew multiple sorties daily. Rommel's panzers, when they moved at all, did so at night to avoid the fighter-bombers that turned daylight movement into suicide. His maintenance crews performed miracles keeping tanks operational, cannibalizing wrecks for parts, jerry-rigging repairs that violated every engineering principle but kept a few dozen panzers combat-ready. And through it all, Hitler sent telegrams, inspirational telegrams about willpower and destiny, telegrams promising supply convoys that never arrived or arrived at half strength after being savaged by submarines, telegrams forbidding any withdrawal, any elastic defense, any tactical flexibility. Stand fast, hold every meter, victory through determination. Rommel's staff officers began speaking in euphemisms. They talked about mobile defense and tactical adjustments and strategic realignment, bureaucratic camouflage for the retreat they all knew was necessary but dared not name directly. Rommel himself drafted multiple versions of a withdrawal plan, working late into the desert nights by lamplight, calculating march rates and fuel consumption and rearguard positions. He kept these plans in a locked case, knowing that their very existence could be interpreted as defeatism if reported to Berlin by the wrong person. His subordinate commanders grew increasingly desperate. Colonel von Ravenstein, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, had presented casualty reports showing his unit was at 40% strength. with barely 30 operational tanks remaining from an authorized complement of over 100. General Crewell, before his capture in May, had warned Rommel explicitly that the Afrika Korps was burning through irreplaceable veteran personnel at rates that would leave them with hollow formations manned by teenagers and convalescents. The Italian General Bastico, nominally Rommel's superior but effectively his subordinate, had conveyed Rome's concerns that another offensive would result in the complete loss of Italy's North African army. All of them understood the same fundamental truth. They were being ordered to commit suicide by a man who viewed warfare as an expression of ideological will rather than a contest of material resources. September 1942. Intelligence reports confirmed what Rommel had feared. Montgomery had arrived in Egypt with a trainload of American equipment and a methodical plan. British supply columns rolled down Egyptian roads in convoys that stretched for miles, trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, all of it fresh from factories across the Atlantic. The Americans were sending armor faster than British crews could train on it. Sherman tanks, equipped with radios in every vehicle and carrying 75 rounds of ammunition per gun, and appearing in British formations opposite Rommel's lines. Behind them came Grant tanks, Crusaders in reserve, self-propelled artillery pieces, truck-mounted anti-aircraft guns, mobile repair workshops, tanker trucks full of high-octane fuel. Rommel received a captured British logistics summary that detailed Montgomery's supply situation. The numbers were obscene by German standards. The British Eighth Army was receiving 12,000 tons of supplies daily. 12,000 tons. Rommel's entire Afrika Korps, 7 divisions and attached units, was receiving perhaps 3,000 tons on good days, often less than half that when convoys were sunk or diverted. The disparity was not merely numerical. It represented two entirely different conceptions of how to wage mechanized war. The British treated logistics as the foundation of operations. They built overwhelming material superiority, then attacked with the confidence that comes from knowing reinforcements and resupply were guaranteed. The Germans treated logistics as a problem to be overcome through cleverness and willpower, a temporary inconvenience that brilliant tactics could compensate for. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It was failing in Africa because the desert offered no captured supply depots, no friendly populations to requisition food from, no intact railroads to exploit. Africa revealed the truth that Nazi ideology preferred to ignore. Modern warfare was, at its core, industrial mathematics. The side that produced more steel, more oil, more bullets, more calories would eventually win regardless of tactical brilliance or ideological fervor. Rommel wrote another letter to Berlin. This one abandoned diplomatic language. He stated flatly that without immediate and massive supply reinforcement, the Afrika Korps would be destroyed in the coming battle. He requested permission to execute a fighting withdrawal to defensible positions in Libya, preserving his forces for a campaign where they might actually have a chance of success. He pointed out that losing Egypt was preferable to losing the entire African army. That strategic depth allowed for future counteroffensives. That Hitler's obsession with holding every meter of ground was costing Germany its most experienced desert divisions. The response came from Field Marshal Keitel, Hitler's chief military toady. The telegram was marked most urgent and contained phrases like Führer expects and duty demands and no retreat under any circumstances. It concluded with a barely veiled threat. The Führer reminds Field Marshal Rommel that German soldiers do not retreat. They hold or they fall where they stand. The example set by leadership in Africa will be watched closely in Berlin. Rommel understood the subtext. Obey or be relieved. Stand and die or be branded a defeatist. Hitler was not interested in military advice. He was interested in obedience to his will, in theatrical gestures of determination that could be sold to the German public as heroism regardless of their strategic pointlessness. October 23, 1942, 9:40 p.m. The world exploded. 1,000 British artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, a bombardment so intense it could be heard in Alexandria 40 miles away. The desert lit up as if a second sun had risen at midnight. Shells fell like steel rain, obliterating forward positions, detonating minefields, cutting communication wires, burying men alive in collapsing trenches. The noise was beyond sound. It was a physical pressure that turned organs to jelly and snapped minds like dry twigs. German and Italian soldiers huddled in their slit trenches and prayed to gods they had forgotten, clawing at sand with bare hands, urinating themselves without shame, screaming words no human voice could carry above the apocalyptic thunder. The barrage lasted 5 hours. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost as terrible as the noise, a ringing emptiness filled with the moans of the wounded and the hiss of sand sliding into fresh craters. Then came the British infantry, advancing behind a creeping barrage, sappers clearing lanes through minefields while Matilda tanks ground forward through the darkness. They came slowly, methodically, exactly as Montgomery had planned, grinding forward meter by meter with the patience of men who knew they had infinite reserves, and their enemy had none. Rommel was not at the front. He was in Germany on medical leave, recovering from the jaundice and exhaustion that had finally forced him to admit his body could not sustain the pace he had demanded of it. His replacement, General Stumm, died of a heart attack during the first day of battle, riding in his command vehicle toward the sound of guns that killed him with stress before shrapnel could. Command fell to General von Thoma, a capable officer who understood immediately that the Afrika Korps was being annihilated and possessed no authority to order the retreat that might save a fraction of it. Hitler's staff flew Rommel back to Africa on October 25th, rushing him to Egypt to work another miracle. He arrived to find his defensive lines shattered, his Italian divisions melting away in mass surrenders, his panzer reserves burning across the desert under relentless air attack. Montgomery had 900 tanks in the field. Rommel had barely 100 operational panzers, and half of those were Italian models that couldn't penetrate British armor at any range. The fuel situation had deteriorated beyond crisis. Some panzer companies were completely immobile, dug in as stationary pillboxes because they lacked the diesel to maneuver. On November 2nd, after 11 days of fighting that consumed the last of his reserves, Rommel sent a telegram to Hitler requesting permission to withdraw. It was not phrased as a request. It was phrased as notification of an already necessary decision, a final attempt to extract some portion of his army before it was completely encircled. He explained that his forces had fought with unparalleled courage, that they had inflicted heavy casualties on Montgomery's army, but that continued resistance in place would result in total annihilation within days. He needed to retreat immediately to save any part of the Afrika Korps from capture. Hitler's response arrived on November 3rd. It has become infamous in military history, studied in staff colleges as an example of ideological leadership detached from reality. The Führer's order was unambiguous. In the situation in which you find yourself, there can be no thought of anything but standing fast, not retreating a single step, throwing every gun and every man into the battle. Considerable Air Force reinforcements are being sent to Commander-in-Chief South. The Duce and the Comando Supremo will also make the utmost efforts to send you the means to continue the fight. Your enemy, despite his superiority, must also be at the end of his strength. It would not be the first time in history that a strong will has triumphed over the bigger battalions. As to your troops, you can show them no other road than that to victory or death. Victory or death. Rommel read the telegram 3 times in the fading light of his command tent. Around him, his staff officers waited silently, their faces drawn with exhaustion and a kind of hopeless resignation. They knew what the order meant. They knew that substantial Air Force reinforcements were fantasy, that the Italians had nothing left to send, that Montgomery was not at the end of his strength, but rather preparing for the final encirclement that would bag what remained of the Afrika Korps like animals driven into a net. And they knew that Rommel, for all his brilliance and growing disillusionment, would obey. Because he was a German officer, because he had sworn oaths, because the alternative was to place himself outside the system that defined his entire identity. The retreat, when it finally happened, was chaos. Rommel waited 18 hours after receiving Hitler's order, a delay that cost thousands of lives and dozens of irreplaceable vehicles. Then, with British armor already cutting the coast road behind him, he ordered a withdrawal without waiting for Berlin's permission. It was partial disobedience, grudging and too late, driven more by tactical necessity than principled opposition. His forces fled westward in ragged columns, harried every mile by British aircraft and armored cars, abandoning equipment, leaving behind wounded, disintegrating as a cohesive force. The Italian divisions surrendered en masse. 30,000 men marched into captivity rather than continue a retreat they knew was hopeless. German units fared only slightly better, fighting desperate rearguard actions that bought time measured in hours, losing their heaviest equipment when fuel ran out, finally staggering back into Libya as shattered remnants of the formations that had conquered half of North Africa. Rommel saved perhaps 40,000 men from the wreckage, less than half his original strength. He lost 600 tanks, 400 artillery pieces, 1,000 trucks, and the illusion that German tactical brilliance could overcome material inferiority. The Afrika Korps continued to exist as an organizational entity, but it was a ghost, a name on maps representing divisions that existed more on paper than in reality. And Hitler, when informed that Rommel had retreated despite explicit orders to stand fast, said nothing. There was no court-martial, no dramatic relief from command. The Führer simply ignored the disobedience, as if acknowledging it would require admitting that his order had been impossible to obey. The propaganda machine pivoted smoothly, transforming defeat into a strategic withdrawal, praising the Afrika Korps's fighting spirit while omitting any mention of the supplies that had never arrived or the permission to retreat that had been criminally withheld. There is a museum in Munich where they keep some of Rommel's personal effects from the North African campaign. Among them is a leather map case, worn and sun-faded, still stained with the dust of Egyptian deserts. Inside, preserved behind glass, are the telegrams, the ones begging for supplies, the ones requesting permission to retreat, the final one ordering him to stand fast unto death. Visitors walk past these artifacts quickly, embarrassed perhaps by the naked desperation in Rommel's increasingly urgent prose, uncomfortable with evidence that contradicts the clean narrative of heroic sacrifice. But there is a truth in those telegrams that transcends the specific tragedy of one army in one desert. It is the truth that ideology, when divorced from reality, becomes a form of murder. Hitler's refusal to permit Rommel's retreat was not a military decision. It was a theological one, rooted in the Nazi belief that will and destiny trumped material fact, that German soldiers were not bound by the same physical limitations as other men. That retreat was spiritual weakness before it was tactical necessity. This belief killed thousands of men who might have been saved. It destroyed an army that might have been preserved to fight another day. And it revealed, for anyone willing to see, the fundamental bankruptcy of a system that valued symbolic gestures over human survival, that demanded obedience even unto pointless death, that could not admit error without unraveling its entire ideological foundation. Rommel learned this lesson in the desert, though he learned it too late and incompletely. He remained a German officer, torn between professional duty and moral clarity, capable of recognizing Hitler's madness, but unable to fully oppose it. 2 years later, he would be forced to commit suicide for his peripheral involvement in the plot to assassinate the Führer, drinking poison in the back seat of an SS staff car while his son waited outside. His death, like his retreat from Alamein, came too late to save anything but a fragment of personal honor. The 7 divisions he had begged to withdraw became a symbol, though not the one Hitler intended. They represented not German determination, but German waste, the squandering of irreplaceable human capital in service of ideology that mistook fanaticism for strategy. Other generals in other theaters would receive similar orders, stand fast at Stalingrad, hold Fortress Combe, defend Berlin to the last child soldier. And each time, the orders would be phrased as tests of will, as opportunities to demonstrate ideological purity through sacrifice. But the desert teaches a simpler lesson, one written in the bleached bones of men and machines abandoned to the sand. Courage without fuel is just immobility. Determination without ammunition is just noise. And orders to hold impossible positions are not tests of character. They are simply murder by bureaucracy, killing as surely as a bullet, but without the honesty of admitting what is being done. Rommel understood this, finally, standing in the wreckage of his command. He understood that he had served a system that valued obedience over victory, symbolism over survival, the Führer's pride over the lives of tens of thousands of young men who had trusted him to use their courage wisely. He had been Germany's most celebrated general, Der Wüstenfuchs, the master of mobile warfare. And in the end, he had learned the same lesson that every soldier learns who survives long enough, that tactics are meaningless without strategy, that strategy is meaningless without logistics, and that all the military brilliance in the world cannot overcome leadership that confuses fantasy with planning. The British swept across North Africa in the wake of Alamein, rolling up Axis positions with methodical certainty. They would meet American forces landing in Morocco and Algeria, linking arms across the continent, trapping what remained of Rommel's command in Tunisia. Within 6 months, the last German soldiers in Africa would surrender, joining the Italian prisoners in camps that sprawled across the Egyptian desert. And the supply convoys that Hitler had promised, the reinforcements that never came, would be revealed as lies, not because Germany lacked the resources to send them, but because those resources were being diverted to Russia, to the insatiable furnace of the Eastern Front, where Hitler's ideological ambitions were consuming an entire generation. Rommel's 7 divisions had been sacrificed not to hold strategically vital ground, but to maintain the illusion that the Führers could reshape reality through force of belief. It was a lesson that Nazi Germany would repeat until the system collapsed entirely, taking millions of lives with it into the rubble. The telegrams in the Munich Museum say all of this, if you read them carefully. They chronicle the transformation of a professional soldier into something more tragic, a man who understood he was being ordered to commit institutionalized murder-suicide, who possessed the tactical genius to recognize the insanity, but who could not quite find the moral courage to disobey completely until it was far too late to matter. That hesitation, that final deference to authority he knew was criminal, became Rommel's true desert monument. Not his victories, which faded like mirages in the heat, but his refusal to break the chain of obedience, even when that chain was strangling the men who trusted him, even when he knew, with absolute certainty, that loyalty to Hitler was betrayal of everyone and everything else. The desert keeps its secrets well, but this one, at least, is written clearly in the space between telegrams, in the silence where permission to retreat should have been given but never came, in the unmarked graves of 7 divisions who died not for territory or strategy, but for one man's refusal to admit he had been wrong. It was not heroism. It was not even tragedy in the classical sense. It was simply waste, the particular kind of waste that occurs when ideology mistakes itself for reality and demands that reality be sacrificed to preserve the illusion. Rommel begged for permission to save his army. Hitler refused, not because the strategic situation required sacrifice, but because Nazi doctrine could not admit that German soldiers, properly motivated, might actually need supplies and rest and realistic orders. And so they died, or fled, or surrendered, and became footnotes in a campaign that was already lost before it began, doomed not by British prowess or American steel, but by a leadership that had confused willpower with gasoline and determination with artillery shells. The lesson, purchased at the price of tens of thousands of lives, remains unlearned by those who need it most. Because the men who give such orders never stand in the desert themselves, never taste the iron and ash, never watched their soldiers dig graves in sand too hard to yield. They sit in distant bunkers, pushing pins across maps, confusing movement of symbols with movement of men. And when the symbols disappear, they simply order more, as if courage and obedience were infinite resources that could be requisitioned like ammunition. But they are not infinite, and when they are spent in service of delusion, nothing grows in their place but the bitter knowledge that comes too late, carried by survivors like Rommel who understand they were complicit in crimes disguised as military necessity. The desert wind still blows across Alamein, shifting sand over the tank tracks and shell craters that have almost disappeared after 80 years. The monuments stand silent, marking ground that thousands died to hold for reasons that made no sense then and make even less sense now. And somewhere in the depths of archives, the telegrams remain, fading slowly, waiting for historians who will read them and wonder how men of intelligence and education convinced themselves that obeying mad orders was somehow more honorable than refusing them. There is no answer to that question that does not indict the entire system that made it necessary to ask. Rommel begged for permission to retreat 7 divisions. Hitler refused to give it. And in that refusal lies a truth about power and obedience and the cost of mistaking loyalty for wisdom. A truth written in sand and blood, forgotten by each generation until they learn it again the hard way, in deserts of their own making, following orders that lead only to graves that stretch beyond the horizon.